After losing his wife in a tragic accident, former Denver officer Michael Hayes takes his 10-year-old daughter, Sophie, to the mountains of Stillwater Creek, Montana. They've just bought an abandoned log cabin for $5, a desperate chance at a fresh start, far from the noise, far from the pain. But in these woods, silence doesn't always mean peace. On their very first night, Sophie notices muddy paw prints leading under the floorboards. Then comes the sound, soft at first, then sharper, the scratching of claws in the dark. What they find beneath that cabin will change everything. Things they thought they'd lost, and reveal a miracle they never saw coming. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and if you believe that God still works through second chances. Hit like, subscribe, and let's see how one small act of grace can heal even the deepest wounds. The wind carried winter's last breath across the mountains of Montana, whispering through pines and drifting over long stretches of frozen earth. The sun was low, a pale coin behind sheets of cloud, as Michael Hayes gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford and followed the narrow dirt road climbing toward Stillwater Creek. Snow crackled under the tires. Every mile carried him farther from Denver and farther from the life he no longer recognized. Beside him, 10-year-old Sophie sat quietly, wrapped in a wool coat several sizes too big. Her small hands held a stuffed rabbit whose fur had thinned from years of comfort. She hadn't spoken much since the accident, the one that had taken her mother Anna, and left Michael with a silence heavier than any wound. The truck heater rattled weakly. Michael's fingers tightened on the wheel, knuckles pale against the leather. He was 47, though the gray in his hair and the lines around his eyes made him look older. Once a respected Denver police officer, now just a man running from the sound of his own memories, he'd resigned 6 months ago. No more sirens, no more scenes of grief that mirrored his own. They had come north through a relocation program for veterans and ex-officers, offering forgotten cabins in abandoned areas for a symbolic price. $5 and a signature, that's what the paper had said. A new start for those who'd lost too much. Sophie pressed her forehead to the window, her breath clouding the glass. "Is it far?" she murmured, the first words in hours. "Almost there, kiddo," Michael said softly. His voice caught in the space between reassurance and fatigue. The road turned, revealing a wooden sign half buried in snow. Stillwater Creek. Pop 14. The letters were faded, the population number clearly a lie. He followed the trail another half-mile until the trees opened into a clearing. The cabin stood at the center of it, a squat, weather-beaten structure of pine logs and sagging shingles. Snow clung to the roof like tired shoulders carrying too much weight. A rusted chimney leaned slightly to one side. Michael parked the truck, cut the engine, and let the silence settle. The world felt impossibly still. Even the wind seemed to pause. "This is it," he said, forcing cheer into his tone. $5 well spent." Sophie didn't answer. She stepped out into the snow, boots crunching, her eyes wide as she took in the desolate clearing. The air smelled of pine resin and cold stone. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once and fell silent. Inside, the cabin was smaller than the photos had suggested. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of damp wood. A stove stood in the corner, its iron body cold and dull. Mismatched mugs lined a shelf above a small sink. There was one sagging couch, one table, and a bed frame without a mattress. Michael set down their bags and rubbed his hands together. "It's not much, but it's ours," he said, half to Sophie, half to himself. She wandered to the nearest window, tracing circles into the frost. Her reflection looked ghostly against the glass. Pale skin, long brown hair tangled from the wind. Michael watched her, guilt tightening in his chest. He wondered if bringing her here had been selfish, if trying to start over in isolation would help her or bury her further in silence. He went outside to unload the last crate from the truck. The air had that peculiar Montana chill, so dry it almost hummed. The sun dipped lower, bleeding orange light across the snow. He caught a glimpse of something carved into the porch post. An old mark, worn by weather. It looked like a cross or a pair of overlapping letters. He brushed at it with his glove, but couldn't make it out. By the time the sun disappeared, the cabin was dim, except for the light of a single lantern. Michael built a small fire in the stove. Sparks rose, flickering across the walls, chasing shadows back into the corners. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor near the fire, holding her rabbit close. Her gaze followed the flames as if searching for something inside them. Michael sat beside her, stretching his tired legs. "You know," he said quietly, "your mom always wanted a place like this, somewhere quiet. She used to talk about Montana, said the air here could heal people." Sophie's lips trembled, and for a moment he thought she might speak, but instead she leaned her head against his arm. He felt the smallest weight of trust return, fragile as glass. They ate canned soup in silence. Outside, the wind began to rise, brushing against the cabin like fingertips across glass. Michael checked the locks, adjusted the wood in the stove, and finally settled into the worn sofa. His mind drifted toward the kind of sleep that wasn't rest but escape. It was past midnight when he woke. The fire had burned low, the only light the dull red of coals. For a moment he couldn't tell what had stirred him. Then he heard it, a faint scratching. At first it sounded like the wind against the boards, but then came another sound, claws dragging slowly along the underside of the floor. The hair on his neck lifted. He sat up, listening. Sophie was asleep, her small hand curled around the rabbit. The scratching came again, steady, rhythmic, close. He rose quietly, the old boards groaning beneath his boots. The sound stopped. He waited. Then, just as he exhaled, it came once more, louder this time, near the back wall. He grabbed the flashlight from the table, sweeping the beam across the room. Dust motes shimmered like ghosts. Nothing moved. He knelt near the floorboards where the sound seemed strongest and pressed his ear against the wood. Underneath the cabin, something shifted. A soft thump, then silence. "Probably raccoons," he muttered, though even to himself it sounded like a lie. When he turned back, Sophie was sitting up, her eyes wide. "Dad." "What is it?" "Nothing to worry about," he said. "Just an animal under the house." Her gaze lingered on the dark corner near the stove. "It doesn't sound like an animal." He opened his mouth to reassure her, but stopped. There, in the faint layer of dust between them, were footprints, small, wet prints leading from the door to the edge of the rug. The shape was uneven, animal-like, but too large for a raccoon. He crouched, touching one. The mud was fresh. He glanced toward the door, still bolted. Outside, the wind howled once, then faded into silence again. Michael backed toward the stove, pulse thudding. He kept the flashlight trained on the floor. Nothing moved, yet the air in the room felt charged, alive. Sophie whispered, "Dad?" He forced a smile he didn't feel. "Go back to sleep, kiddo. We'll check in the morning." But even as she lay back down, clutching her rabbit tight, he stayed awake, listening to the cabin breathe. And somewhere beneath them, in that unseen hollow of frozen earth and wood, something scratched again, slow and patient, as if it had all the time in the world. Outside, the snow began to fall once more, covering the road that had brought them here. Morning came pale and quiet, a light snow still drifting through the trees like forgotten ash. The fire in the stove had gone out, and the cabin breathed cold again. Michael woke stiff and uneasy, the memory of that scratching still fresh in his head. For a long moment he sat on the edge of the couch, listening. Nothing, only the faint creak of wood settling in the frost. Sophie was already awake, sitting by the window, her breath fogging the glass. "It stopped," she whispered, without turning. "What did?" "The noise," she said, "from last night." He tried to smile, probably a fox or something, but he knew foxes didn't leave prints shaped like those he'd seen on the dusty floorboards. He made breakfast, instant oatmeal and tea boiled in a dented kettle. Sophie ate in silence, eyes flicking now and then to the dark spot near the stove where the prints had been. When they finished, Michael grabbed the flashlight and said, "Stay inside, all right? I just want to check the crawl space under the cabin." She nodded, but didn't move closer. Outside, the air had that crystalline stillness only deep winter knows. The ground crunched under his boots as he crouched beside the cabin and pulled aside a loose plank. Cold air exhaled from beneath, smelling of earth and something else, wet fur. He angled the flashlight into the gap. At first he saw nothing but dirt and splintered beams. Then something shifted deeper in the shadows. A flicker of movement. 2 eyes opened. Amber, gleaming, unblinking. Michael froze. For an instant, the thing didn't move. Then came a low whine, soft, trembling. Not a growl, not a threat. A plea. "Hey," he whispered, lowering the light. "Easy there." He reached for the crowbar leaning nearby and carefully pried loose one of the floorboards from above. It came up with a groan, spilling dust and bits of old insulation. The smell hit him, animal musk, blood, damp earth. He lifted another board. Then he saw her, a German shepherd, gaunt and trembling, her fur matted with dirt and dried blood. One leg was twisted awkwardly, the paw swollen. Around her neck hung a torn leather collar, the tag worn smooth by time, and beside her 3 small pups, no older than a few weeks, huddled together for warmth. Michael's heart clenched. The mother looked up at him, not with fear, but with something older, deeper. Exhaustion edged with trust. "Jesus," he murmured, "you poor thing." He slid the rest of the boards aside and reached down. The dog didn't move, only watched him with those amber eyes. Slowly, he lifted her, cradling her against his chest, feeling the sharp bones beneath her fur. She was light, too light. The pups whimpered as he set her gently on the rug inside, then gathered them in a blanket. Sophie stood near the table, eyes wide. "Is she alive?" "Barely," Michael said. He knelt beside the dog, checking her pulse, feeling the faint rise of breath. "But she's fighting." He found an old tin cup under the sink and filled it with water, setting it beside her muzzle. She didn't drink at first. Then, trembling, she lapped weakly. Sophie watched, her small hands fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. She was under the house? Yeah, must have crawled there to get warm. "Someone left her," the girl whispered. Michael's gaze fell on something lying near the crawl space opening outside, a rusted tin can of dog food, long empty. And next to it, a dented metal cup, the kind used by campers or miners. Someone had been feeding her. He stared at the cup, turning it in his hand. The initials ED were scratched faintly into the bottom. He frowned. Whoever left this didn't go far. When he came back inside, Sophie was kneeling beside the shepherd, stroking her ear with a tenderness that made his throat tighten. The dog didn't flinch. Her tail twitched once. "What should we call her?" Sophie asked. Michael hesitated. "Let's make sure she makes it first." But the girl shook her head, her voice quiet but certain. "Her name is Grace." It stopped him cold. He hadn't heard Sophie speak a full sentence since the funeral. The word felt sacred, like a prayer. "Grace," he repeated, and the dog's ears flicked as if she recognized it. For the rest of the day, he cleaned her wounds with warm water and peroxide, bandaged her paw, and placed her and the pups by the fire. The warmth revived a faint spark in her eyes. Sophie sat close, whispering softly to the smallest pup as snow whispered against the window. By evening, the cabin felt different, less hollow, less haunted. Even the silence had changed. As Michael set another log on the fire, he noticed Sophie sketching something on a scrap of paper, the outline of Grace, her pups, and the glow of the stove. Her pencil moved with new life. "You're getting good at that," he said. She smiled faintly. "She makes it easy." That night, after Sophie fell asleep, Michael stepped outside for air. The moon hung low and swollen, pouring silver over the snow. He walked around the cabin, flashlight in hand, eyes scanning the tree line. There were tracks, boot prints leading toward the woods, fresh. He followed a few steps, then stopped. They ended abruptly near the creek, as if the person had simply vanished. The wind picked up, rustling through branches. Michael turned back toward the cabin, the small circle of light glowing from the window. Inside, he could see Grace sleeping beside Sophie, the pups curled against her belly. He exhaled slowly. Maybe whoever left her here hadn't meant harm. Maybe they were running from something too. But as he reached the porch, his beam caught the porch post again, the one with the old carved mark. Under the frost, he could see it clearly now, 2 letters intertwined, E.D. He stared at it a long moment, the initials matching those on. The metal cup. The pieces didn't fit yet, but something deep in his gut whispered that they would. When he went back inside, the cabin was quiet, except for the crackle of fire and the soft breathing of those within. He sat down on the floor beside Grace, her muzzle resting on his boot. Her fur was coarse, her breathing uneven but steady. He whispered, "You're safe now." Her tail brushed the floor once, as if she understood, and for the first time in months, Michael felt the faint, unfamiliar pulse of peace. 3 days passed. The storm had been building since dawn, rolling in from the north like an army of white ghosts. By late afternoon, the wind screamed through the trees, dragging veils of snow across the clearing. Michael secured the last shutter, breath steaming, his fingers numb through his gloves. Inside, the cabin glowed warm and golden, defiant against the blizzard that swallowed the world. Grace lay near the stove, her pups sleeping in a tight knot of fur. Her eyes followed Michael's every movement. She was healing, slowly. The swelling in her leg had gone down, and she could limp a few steps before resting again. Sophie sat cross-legged by the fire, sketching quietly, her face soft in the flickering light. Every so often, she would glance at Grace and smile, that small, fragile kind of smile that still carried traces of grief. Michael poured coffee into a chipped mug and sat opposite her. "Storm's getting bad," he said. "Might lose power." "We have fire," Sophie replied without looking up. "And Grace." He chuckled softly. "You trust that dog more than me already." Sophie's pencil paused. "Grace doesn't try to tell me everything will be fine." The words hit him harder than she meant. He wanted to say something, but the wind howled against the walls, drowning the silence between them. Night fell early. Snow pounded the roof in waves. The lantern flickered, shadows shifting across the cabin like restless spirits. Grace stirred suddenly, ears pricked, a low rumble rising from her chest. Michael looked up. "What is it, girl?" She was staring at the window, the one facing the tree line. Her hackles rose. The scratching came next, not from below this time, but outside, faint but distinct, against the wooden wall. Michael grabbed the flashlight and stepped toward the door. "Stay with her," he told Sophie. When he opened it, a blast of wind punched through, biting cold and blinding snow. He swept the beam across the porch, then the yard. For a moment, nothing, just white chaos. Then he saw it, a figure moving slowly through the storm. A man. He stumbled forward, wrapped in a torn brown coat, his face half hidden by a scarf crusted with ice. One arm hung stiff at his side, the other shielded his eyes from the wind. Michael gripped the flashlight tighter. "Hey," he called over the gale. "You all right?" The man stopped at the edge of the porch light's reach. His voice came ragged, torn by the storm. "Didn't think anyone lived here." "I do now," Michael replied. "Cabin's mine." The stranger studied him a moment, then took a few steps closer. His face came into focus. Thin, hollow-cheeked, maybe late 50s. A gray beard clung to his jaw, uneven and frostbitten. His eyes, pale blue, carried the dull sheen of someone who'd seen too much and believed too little. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "This house, it don't forget." Michael frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man gave a humorless laugh. "I worked the mines up near Cold Ridge. Knew the folks who used to live here. Good people, till the snow took 'em." He looked past Michael, toward the cabin's glow. "Some say the place swallows what it wants." Grace appeared in the doorway then, her silhouette framed by firelight. She growled low, protective but controlled. The man froze. "That your dog?" "She is now," Michael said. The man's gaze lingered on her. "You find her under the floor?" Michael's blood went cold. "How do you know that?" The wind roared between them. The man's eyes flicked toward the tree line. "Because I left her there." For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Grace lunged forward, barking furiously, the sound cutting through the storm like shrapnel. The man stumbled back, slipping in the snow. "Easy," Michael shouted, grabbing Grace's collar before she could leap off the porch. The man caught his balance, breathing hard. Didn't mean her harm. She wouldn't leave the spot. Sat there for days after it happened. "After what happened?" Michael demanded. The stranger's face tightened. "You don't want those stories, officer." Michael stiffened. "How do you know who I am?" The man's mouth twitched into a faint, bitter smile. "You've got that look. The one people get after they've buried too many truths." The wind picked up again, throwing flakes like knives. The man pulled his scarf higher. "Name's Earl Dalton." Michael's heart hammered. "E.D. The initials on the cup, the mark on the porch post." He didn't move. "You left the dog." Earl nodded once. "Couldn't take her with me. Thought I'd come back when it was over. Guess I never did." "Over?" Michael asked. But Dalton only shook his head. "You should leave this place, Hayes. Some houses remember grief too well." Then he turned, stepping back into the storm. "Wait," Michael called. But the man was already fading into the white, swallowed by wind and snow. Grace stopped barking. She stood motionless, watching the place where he'd vanished. Her breathing was heavy, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the trees. Michael closed the door and leaned against it, chest rising and falling. Sophie stared at him from across the room, pale as the snow outside. "Who was that?" He hesitated. "Someone who used to know this place." Why did Grace bark like that? Michael looked down at the dog. She was pacing now, restless, tail stiff, ears pinned back. Then suddenly she stopped by the corner near the stove, the same spot where he'd first heard the scratching, and pressed her paw gently to the floorboards. Sophie whispered, "Dad, she's scared." "No," he said slowly. "She's remembering." He crouched beside her, brushing his fingers through her fur. Grace looked at him with those same amber eyes, deep, steady, unreadable. The storm raged outside, shaking the windows. Inside, firelight danced across the walls, flickering over the carved initials on the porch beam just beyond the door. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just been warned, not threatened. That the man named Earl Dalton wasn't the danger, only the messenger, and whatever haunted the cabin wasn't finished yet. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt sacred. When morning came, the world outside was transformed. Trees bowed under the weight of snow, and the sun rose weakly through a sky washed pale as bone. Michael stood on the porch, coffee steaming in his hand, staring at the footprints half buried near the tree line. They were already fading. Earl Dalton had vanished into the white, as if he'd never been there at all. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and damp fur. Grace slept near the stove, her pups nestled close, tiny paws twitching in dreams. Sophie sat at the table, her pencil scratching over paper. She was drawing Dalton's face from memory, sharp lines, hollow eyes, the kind of expression you didn't forget. Michael watched her. "You sure you want to draw him?" She nodded. He looked lonely. He smiled faintly. "Yeah, that's one word for it." After breakfast, Michael began checking the cabin for damage. The storm had shaken loose a few shingles, but the structure held firm. When he reached the back wall near the crawlspace, he noticed something odd, a dark stain on the lower boards. At first he thought it was old oil, but when he scraped it gently with his knife, he found a faint engraving underneath. Letters. Numbers. He crouched, tracing them with his thumb. K943D. The metal tag of an old police training code. His breath caught. He turned toward Grace. She was watching him, ears tilted forward, eyes alert. "You've got something to tell me, don't you?" he murmured. That afternoon, when the light was soft and gray, Michael cleaned her bandages. As he brushed back the fur around her neck to check for sores, he froze. Just below her left ear, nearly hidden beneath the coarse sable hair, was a burn scar, faint but distinct, in the same shape as the K9 mark on the wall. A training brand, used years ago before they switched to tattoo IDs. He whispered, "You were one of us." Grace's ears twitched at the tone. She lifted her head slightly, eyes meeting his with that uncanny stillness unique to shepherds who've seen too much. He looked at her tag again. No name, no number, just the worn collar. "Who left you, girl?" That night, long after Sophie went to bed, Michael sat at the table with his laptop, the old one he'd barely touched since Denver. The weak internet connection from a nearby ranger tower flickered in and out, but after an hour of searching, he found it. Montana State Police K9 Unit, Cold Ridge Division, disbanded 2018. He clicked the archived report. Unit dissolved following fire at training facility. Multiple dogs unaccounted for. Suspected arson. No suspects identified. A photo loaded, blurred, grainy, taken from an old report. Among the dogs lined up, one caught his breath. Grace. Younger, stronger, but unmistakable. The same amber eyes, the same scar at her muzzle's edge. Michael leaned back, rubbing, a hand over his face. Christ. He remembered Dalton's words. She wouldn't leave the spot, sat there for days after it happened. Days after the fire, after her handler, maybe Dalton, vanished. The realization came slowly, like dawn over the snow. Dalton hadn't been warning him out of malice. He was drowning in guilt. Michael looked toward the fire. Grace was awake now, watching him. "You lost someone too, didn't you?" Her tail moved once, a quiet acknowledgement. He poured a small bowl of water, set it beside her, then sat down on the floor beside her bed. For a while, neither moved. Outside, the wind sighed through the eaves, soft and tired. "You know," he said quietly, "in Denver after the accident, I couldn't even look at my badge. I'd tell myself I quit because of the politics, the hours, the bureaucracy." He laughed dryly. "Truth is, I was just done. The night Anna died, I was supposed to pick her up. But a call came in. Domestic dispute. Suspect armed. I told her to wait. By the time I got there..." His voice broke off. Grace rested her head on his knee, as if sensing the weight behind the silence. Sophie stirred in her sleep. The fire crackled softly. Michael exhaled, eyes wet. "Guess we're both ghosts, huh?" Grace made a low sound. Not quite a whine. Not quite a growl. It was the sound of recognition, of something wordless passing between the living and the almost lost. He reached to scratch behind her ear and paused, noticing another faint detail. A metal tag sewn into the inside of her collar, barely visible through the worn leather. Using his knife, he pried it loose. A serial number and a name etched into the back. Handler. Dalton E. K9. Name, Grace. The world seemed to tilt. He whispered, "You were his." Grace blinked, slow and deliberate, then laid her head back down. When morning came, Michael told Sophie. She listened quietly, her small fingers tracing the letters on Grace's collar. "So she was a police dog?" "Yeah," he said softly. "Looks like it." "Then why did he leave her?" He didn't answer right away. "Sometimes," he said finally, "people run from the things they can't forgive themselves for." Sophie looked up at him. "Like you did?" Michael smiled faintly, but there was no denial in it. "Yeah, like me." That evening, Sophie sat by the fire with her sketchbook. She drew Grace and the 3 pups, each one pressed against her side. Underneath, she wrote in careful letters, "Grace, the one who stayed." Michael watched her, something loosening inside his chest. He'd come here to escape ghosts. Instead, he'd found one who refused to leave. And somehow, that made all the difference. Outside, the snow began to melt, dripping from the eaves in steady rhythm. The world was shifting again, inch by inch, toward spring. The first hint of spring came not with warmth, but with sound. Water dripping from the eaves, the soft cracking of ice retreating from the earth. For the first time since winter began, Michael opened the cabin windows. The air smelled of pine, damp soil, and something faintly metallic, like the memory of snow. Grace limped across the yard, stronger now, her pups trailing behind in a clumsy parade. Sophie laughed, a small, bright sound that made Michael look up from the porch. She was kneeling near the spot where they had first found Grace, brushing away the last crust of ice with a stick. "She made a den here, right?" "Looks that way," Michael said. Sophie pushed deeper into the patch of thawing dirt. Then she stopped. "Dad?" Her voice changed, sharper, uncertain. Michael walked over, boots crunching on half-frozen mud. "What is it?" She held something in her hands, a piece of faded red fabric, frayed along the edges, stiff with old dirt. For a moment he couldn't place it. Then the world tilted. It was a scarf, a long knitted one, once bright crimson, now dulled to rust and brown. His chest tightened. "Where did you—" "It was stuck under the roots," Sophie whispered. "I just pulled it out." He took it from her, hands trembling. The pattern was unmistakable, crooked stitches where the yarn had doubled back, a tiny snag from where she'd caught it on the truck mirror that morning. "Mom's," he said, barely breathing. Sophie's eyes widened. "You're sure?" He nodded, running his fingers over the rough threads. "She made this herself. Christmas, 3 years ago." They stood there in silence, the scarf fluttering weakly in the wind, like a relic from another life. Back inside, Michael spread it on the table, smoothing the fabric flat. The smell of dust and cold lingered in it. He stared out of it for a long time, thoughts spinning. That scarf had disappeared the night Anna died. The night of the crash on Cold Ridge Highway. He remembered the report, the rain, the overturned vehicle, the way the rescue team told him there was nothing left but twisted metal. And the man who had called it in first, Earl Dalton. Michael rubbed his temples. How the hell did this end up here? Sophie sat across from him, her small hands folded tightly. Maybe she was here, she said softly. Before. Before what? Before the crash. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell her that was impossible, that the scene was 30 miles away, that nothing about it made sense. But the words wouldn't come. The scarf was real. So were Dalton's initials carved into the beam. He rose and went to his duffel bag, pulling out an old file, the one he had promised himself never to open again. The accident report. December 17, 2019, 6:43 p.m. Vehicle found off Cold Ridge Highway, 3 miles north of Red Haven Bridge. Caller: Earl Dalton, resident, Cold Ridge Mining. Victim: Anna Hayes, deceased on scene. Cause: collision, loss of control due to weather. But one line stood out now, one he'd overlooked before, or maybe ignored. Additional items recovered. 1 wedding ring, 1 burned leather wallet. No clothing recovered. The scarf had never been listed. Michael stared at the page, his heart pounding. "Dad," Sophie said quietly. "Grace barked at him, remember? When he came to the door?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, like she knew him." What if Mom did too? He looked up sharply, but Sophie didn't flinch. There was a strange steadiness in her gaze, the kind of clarity grief sometimes brings. That night, Michael sat by the fire long after Sophie went to bed. The scarf lay across his lap, its edges flickering orange in the firelight. Grace sat nearby, her pups asleep beside her. Every so often, she lifted her head and looked toward the door, the same door Dalton had stood in front of. Michael whispered, "You knew her, didn't you?" Grace blinked slowly, then let out a faint sound, almost a sigh. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Was she here? Did she meet him? Of course there was no answer. Only the wind through the cracks and the faint pop of wood in the stove. The next morning, Michael drove into town, his first trip in weeks. Red Haven was still half asleep under late snow, its single main street lined with old storefronts and a church whose bell tower leaned slightly east. He parked in front of the sheriff's office. Inside, Sheriff Tom Alvarez looked up from his desk. He was a broad man in his 60s, skin leathery from years outdoors, his gray mustache as sharp as the rest of his expression. "Hayes," he said, "didn't expect to see you out of that cabin." Michael handed him the scarf. "You ever seen this before?" Tom raised an eyebrow, turning it over. "Old? Handmade?" "Why, my wife's. It vanished after her accident. I found it under my cabin." That got his attention. He leaned back, studying Michael carefully. "You saying someone moved evidence from a crash scene 30 miles away?" "I'm saying," Michael said evenly, "that the man who called in that crash just showed up at my place last week." Dalton's name darkened the sheriff's face. "Earl Dalton still around? I thought he left for Wyoming." "He did," Michael said, "but not before leaving this." Tom sighed. "Dalton's a strange one. Used to work in the Cold Ridge mines. Good worker, quiet. Then that fire burned half the shaft, and he changed. Walked around like he was waiting for something to finish him off." He hesitated. "You think he had something to do with Anna's accident?" "I don't know," Michael said quietly. "But Grace, my dog, used to be his, and she found this." Tom looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Be careful digging up old ghosts, Hayes. That mountain's got plenty already." When Michael drove back to the cabin, the sun was setting behind the ridge, painting the snow orange and gold. He parked the truck, sat in silence for a while, and watched Sophie playing with the pups near the garden. Grace lay beside her, head lifted, eyes calm. He stepped out, the scarf still on the passenger seat. As he picked it up, something slipped from the folds. A small metal button, flattened and dull. He turned it over in his palm. Stamped faintly into the metal were 2 letters, C.R., Cold Ridge, the place where it all began, and where, he now knew, he would have to go back. Spring came shyly to Stillwater Creek, cautious and slow, as if afraid the snow might take offense. The hills shed their white coats, and the stream behind the cabin began to sing again, a thin silver ribbon weaving through dark pines. For the first time in months, the air smelled of wet earth and pine sap instead of cold iron. Michael knelt in the thawing soil behind the cabin, a shovel in one hand, his sleeves rolled up. The ground was stubborn, frozen in patches, but he worked methodically. Beside him, Sophie crouched, helping to clear stones from the edge of the new garden they'd decided to plant. "Tomatoes don't grow this high," Michael said. "Then we'll grow something that does," Sophie replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. He smiled at her determination. The months in the mountains had changed her. Her cheeks held color now, her eyes brighter, steadier. She laughed more often. Sometimes, when he looked at her, he saw the ghost of Anna in the way she tilted her head or bit her lip when concentrating. Grace watched them from the porch, her pups bounding through the soft mud like children at play. The largest one, a male with a white streak across his chest, was particularly fearless, already testing his mother's patience. Grace tolerated it with quiet dignity, her amber eyes always moving, always watchful. In the afternoons, Sophie took to drawing in the sunlight that spilled across the porch. She had a knack for seeing warmth in the ordinary, the gleam of dew on Grace's fur, the way Michael's boots left patterned tracks across the dirt. One Saturday, while buying nails and seeds at the general store in Red Haven, Sophie wandered toward a small display of paintings. Behind the counter stood Margaret Reed, the store's owner, a woman in her late 50s, tall and round-shouldered, with silver hair pinned neatly and the calm presence of someone who'd lived through every kind of weather. Margaret noticed Sophie studying a painting of a river bend. "You like that one, honey?" she asked, her voice warm, lightly cracked with age. Sophie nodded. "It looks like the creek behind our house." Margaret smiled. "You're one of the folks who bought that old cabin up near Stillwater, aren't you? Heard it went for $5. Michael chuckled from behind a shelf. "That's us. Best bargain and worst investment of my life." Margaret's eyes softened. "Well, every home starts as a gamble. You just have to plant the right things and hope they take root." She looked back at Sophie. "You draw?" "A little," the girl said shyly. "You keep at it," Margaret said. "There's an art contest in town next month. Theme's New Beginnings. I think you've got one of those growing in your backyard." The words lingered with Sophie for days. Every afternoon after that, she sketched for hours. Grace and her pups chasing one another in melting snow. Michael repairing the porch, the stream glittering in late light. Each drawing captured something different: movement, patience, forgiveness. Michael watched quietly, often from the doorway, proud but unwilling to say so aloud. He knew too well how fragile peace could be, how it could vanish like breath on glass. But he also knew that holding it too tightly made it slip faster. One evening, as Sophie painted by the fire, Michael decided to take a short walk. The woods had turned soft underfoot, pine needles damp and fragrant. Grace padded beside him, her limp nearly gone now. When they reached the clearing near the stream, he stopped and sat on a fallen log. "You remember this place?" he said softly. First day we came here, I thought this house was a curse. Thought I was running from ghosts. Turns out I was walking straight into the only thing that could save us." Grace rested her head on his knee, tail thumping once. "I don't think Dalton meant harm," he went on. "He was just stuck between guilt and grief. I know what that feels like." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the red scarf, washed, repaired, folded neatly. The button-marked CR glinted faintly in the fading light. "I'm done running," he said. That night the fire in the cabin burned bright. Sophie had finished her latest piece, a full-page sketch of Grace lying among the new garden rows, the pups tumbling over her paws. At the top, she'd written carefully in pencil, "Grace and her children." Michael studied it, nodding slowly. "It's beautiful," he said. "What made you pick that name?" "Because she takes care of everyone," Sophie said. "Even us." He smiled, touched by the truth in her words. "You should enter that contest Margaret mentioned." Sophie bit her lip. "Do you think it's good enough?" "I think," he said, "it's honest, and that's better than good." When the day of the contest arrived, Red Haven was alive with spring. Banners across the square, laughter spilling from the bakery, and a brass band warming up near the church steps. Inside the community hall, children pinned their paintings to wooden easels. Sophie's hands shook as she placed hers among them. Margaret Reed was one of the judges. She paused longest at Sophie's piece, smiling faintly before whispering something to the others. When the winners were announced, Sophie stood frozen until Michael nudged her gently. "Go on," he whispered. "That's your name." She stepped forward, cheeks flushed, as Margaret pinned a blue ribbon beside her drawing. The crowd clapped, and for the first time since Anna's death, Michael felt a kind of fullness that didn't hurt. On the drive home, Sophie held her ribbon in both hands, silent but smiling. Grace rested her head on her lap, eyes half closed. When they reached the cabin, twilight spread gold across the yard. The pups barked as they tumbled through the grass, chasing each other in loops. Michael sat on the porch steps, watching Sophie hang her ribbon above the door. "You know," he said, "this old place isn't cursed anymore." Sophie turned, her eyes bright in the last light. "Was it ever?" He looked out toward the trees. Maybe not. Maybe it was just waiting for the right kind of noise to fill it again. Grace settled beside him, her gaze following Sophie as she laughed, spinning with the pups in the fading sun. The garden they'd planted had already begun to sprout, small green shoots breaking through the thawed earth, fragile but alive. And for the first time, Michael allowed himself to believe that something broken could grow again. Summer settled over Red Haven in a slow golden hush. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin and wildflowers, the mountains painted in soft blue haze. The garden behind the cabin had burst into life, rows of beans, wild daisies, and a single stubborn tomato plant that Sophie swore was a miracle. Grace lay in the shade near the porch, her pups now half-grown, their coats glossy and strong. The once broken cabin stood proud, patched and painted, as if the forest itself had forgiven it. That morning, Michael loaded the old Ford with folding chairs, a picnic basket, and Sophie's sketchbook. Red Haven's Summer Festival, the Festival of Second Chances, was the biggest event of the year. The townsfolk called it that because, in this valley, everyone carried some kind of regret, and every July they came together to trade sorrow for song. As they drove down the winding dirt road, Sophie leaned out the window, her braid whipping in the breeze. "Do you think they'll let Grace come?" Michael glanced at the back seat where Grace sat upright, calm but alert, the pups piled against her. "If they don't, we'll tell them she's family." The town square was already alive when they arrived, bright banners strung across lampposts, the smell of baked bread and coffee wafting from the stalls. children darting between booths clutching paper flags. A small stage had been set up beneath the old oak tree where the brass band played slow, joyful tunes that sounded like sunlight. Margaret Reed stood near the art display table, arranging children's drawings. She spotted Sophie and waved. "Our young artist returns. You ready for your speech, sweetheart?" Sophie froze. "Speech?" Margaret chuckled. "Didn't your father tell you? First prize winners open the festival this year." Michael grinned sheepishly. "I might have forgotten to mention that part." Sophie gave him a mock glare, but her hands fidgeted nervously. He bent down to her level. "You'll be fine. Just speak from the heart." When her name was called, Sophie stepped onto the stage, clutching the edge of the podium. Her voice trembled at first, but when she looked down and saw Grace sitting near the front, tail resting on the ground, her fear seemed to melt away. "My mom used to say families are made of love," Sophie began, her voice soft but clear. "Not just blood. After she died, my dad and I thought we'd never have one again. But then we found Grace. Or maybe Grace found us. She was broken and scared, but she stayed. And because she stayed, we learned how to stay too." The crowd was utterly still. Only the rustle of the banners above broke the silence. "Grace taught us that sometimes second chances don't come looking like we expect," Sophie went on. "Sometimes they have scars. Or forepaws." Her last words drew gentle laughter, followed by a wave of applause that rolled through the square like wind through wheat. Michael felt something crack open inside him. Not pain this time, but light. He wiped his eyes and smiled. Then, through the blur of people, movement caught his eye, a figure standing at the far end of the crowd, just beyond the fence line. Earl Dalton. He looked older than before, thinner, his gray beard unkempt, clothes worn and dusty. But his eyes, the same pale blue, were steady. In one hand he held his cap. Grace saw him too. She rose from where she sat, her head tilting slightly. Michael's breath caught, ready for the growl, the warning bark, but none came. Grace simply walked forward, slow and deliberate, through the parting crowd. When she reached him, she stopped, tail still, eyes fixed on his. For a heartbeat, man and dog stared at each other. Soldier and companion, guilt and forgiveness suspended in the quiet air. Then Grace did something no one expected. She lowered her head. Dalton's lips trembled. He reached out, touching her scarred ear with a trembling hand. "You still remember," he whispered. Michael stepped closer, his voice calm. "You came back." Dalton nodded. "I heard about the festival. Figured if there was ever a place to ask forgiveness, this was it." He glanced down at Grace. "She was the only good thing I ever did, and I still left her behind." "You didn't have to run," Michael said quietly. The older man sighed. "Maybe, but I was afraid. When that fire took my unit, I thought she'd died too. When I saw her again that night, under your house, I didn't know what to say. You were a cop once. You know what it's like to lose your partner." Michael nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do." They stood there in silence for a moment, two men bound by grief neither could name. Then Michael extended his hand. Dalton hesitated before taking it. "I think," Michael said softly, "she forgave you a long time ago." Dalton looked down at Grace, who leaned into his leg once before stepping back toward Sophie. He smiled faintly. "Looks like she's where she belongs." Sophie approached then, her ribbon still pinned proudly to her dress. "You're Mr. Dalton?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "My dad said you used to work with Grace." "That's right." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, then reached out her small hand. "Then thank you for saving her and for helping us find her." Dalton's breath hitched. He took her hand gently, his eyes glistening. "No, sweetheart. She's the one who saved me." By the time the sun began to set, the crowd had dispersed into laughter and music again. The town square glowed with lantern light, and children danced barefoot in the dust. Michael, Sophie, and Grace sat on the edge of the stage, sharing apple pie from a paper plate. Dalton lingered near the gate, watching them, then gave a small nod before walking into the twilight, his figure swallowed by the golden dusk. Michael didn't call after him. Some journeys were meant to end quietly. When they returned to the cabin that evening, the sky was streaked with amber and rose. Sophie fell asleep in the truck, the ribbon still clutched in her hand. Grace sat upright beside her, ears twitching at the hum of crickets. Michael parked and sat for a while, staring at the mountains rising dark against the fading light. The wind came down the slope, soft and full of pine. He whispered, "We're home." Grace turned her head, amber eyes catching the last sunlight. For a brief second, he imagined Anna sitting beside him, her laughter, her warmth, her voice saying, "It's okay to let go." He stepped out of the truck, lifted Sophie gently into his arms, and carried her toward the porch. Grace followed close, her paws silent on the wooden steps. Inside, the house smelled of soil and bread and firewood. The garden outside rustled softly in the evening breeze. The garden they'd planted together, the garden of Grace. As Michael stood at the door, he looked once more toward the dark edge of the woods where the world had once felt like an enemy. Now it felt like something else, like forgiveness taking root. He whispered into the quiet, "Thank you." And somewhere beyond the pines, the wind answered, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers, the memory of second chances, and the peace he had spent a lifetime searching for. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles wrapped in light. Sometimes he sends them with fur, with scars, and with quiet eyes that remind us we were never forgotten. Grace didn't just save a father and his daughter. She reminded them that love survives every winter, that forgiveness can bloom even from ashes. And maybe somewhere in your life there's a grace too, a small sign, a moment of kindness, a second chance you didn't expect. Hold on to it. Because when we open our hearts, we find that God is still working, not in grand gestures, but in the gentle things, a dog's loyalty, a child's laughter, a stranger's forgiveness. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with a prayer. Subscribe for more stories of faith and love, and may the Lord bless you and your family with peace, with healing, and with your own quiet miracle.